So you're very welcome to Steps to Maths, and today we are going to be looking at geometry. And if you remember the last day, we were talking about how to measure a distance from one particular point to another particular point, even though there was a river in the way that we couldn't get through. So we discussed how that we could draw certain triangles on the ground, or we could map out certain triangles on the ground, and because we knew the relationship between certain angles, certain other angles like 45 degrees that we're talking about here, we were able to figure out that this distance would be the same as this distance if we put a right angle in here and a 45-degree angle in here, and that would allow us to figure out where our treasure was buried. So one of the things that we need to know about is what angles are. So an angle is when you have a line here, a straight line, and it rotates about a particular point. It's going to rotate about a pin that's here. And the question is, how much do I rotate this so that this line goes to this line here? So when I'm here and I rotate about a pin, how much do I turn to get from one place to another? So the tool that we use to measure how much we rotate is called a protractor. So you should have one in your construction set, and we will be using that on our squared paper to figure out how many degrees are turned. So we need to understand a little bit about what angles are before we start looking at what the relationship between angles, triangles and lines are. And to do that, we will be practicing measuring angles. So first of all, we're going to need some squared paper. So your standard maths copybook, which you should be able to pick up for maybe a 5-pack of them for €2 or something like that, reasonably cheaply. And we'll be figuring out how to measure angles using the squared paper. The reason I'm using squared paper is I can draw a grid on it. This is something that we will be looking at a little bit later on. We draw a grid like this. So this is just a square grid. There's an up and a down and a left and a right, and we draw it perfectly along the lines on our squared paper. This point here at the very center is called the origin, and we use coordinates to decide how far we are from the origin and where we are on our map. So this is a map. This point here at the very center is where we begin, and it's called the point 0, 0, and we'll see why in a minute. Here's another point over here, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares across and 2 squares up, so that's called the point 5, 2. If I had a point that was 3 squares across and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares up, that would be the point 3. The first number is always how far across you've gone. The second number is how far up you've gone. So it's 3, 6. So in the questions that I'm going to ask you what is the angle between the horizontal and a line drawn through the origin and the point 3, 6. So the horizontal is this line here, and the other line that we're going to draw, we're going to get our ruler, we're going to get a nice sharp pencil, and we're going to draw from the origin 0, 0 through a point 3, 6. And the question I'm going to ask you is, what is the angle between the horizontal and that line? To measure an angle, we get our protractor. This line here between the 0 and the 0 over here, this flat line, has to go flat on one of the legs that we're measuring from. So we're measuring from the horizontal, so this will go perfectly flat along here. Careful it's not turned. Okay, we want our zeros to be perfectly along that line. We measure around a particular point, and the crosshairs of our protractor need to be exactly at that point. Let's get a little bit more light in the situation. So the crosshairs need to be exactly at this point. So there we go. We put our crosshairs there, and we put our flat line from here to here. We will know our crosshairs are perfectly on the line because the 90 will be perfectly up this way as well. So I'm going to ask you to measure the angle from the origin 0, 0 to this point 3, 6, and that will hit there. So let's see if we can figure it out. It's 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 something degrees. So this is the point where we would see 60. It's a little hard to see. So we'll just zoom in on that a little bit now. So you should be able to see that this is 60 degrees. This would be 70 degrees here. And if we look at this point here, that's 60, that's 65. So this looks like it's exactly on 64 degrees. So we're going to measure 64 degrees. If we had measured somewhere between 64 and 65, if it was like halfway between those, we might say 64.5 degrees. So if it was between 64 to 65, as an answer, we could guess 64.5 degrees. Okay, so that's reasonably accurate. You don't have to be perfectly accurate to answer the questions correctly, but have a go at that. So the squared paper is just so you can put a line through the origin to a particular point on the squares. So I'm going to be asking you to go from 0, 0 to 3, 6, which means you go across 1, 2, 3 squares and up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares.